Welcome to the Inner West Library Speaker Series. We'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal and Wongal people of the Eora Nation on which this podcast is produced. We were recently joined by Grant Hilliard and Laura Dalrymple from Marrickville's Feather and Bone Providores. Grant and Laura joined us from the shop floor to discuss their newly published book, The Ethical Omnivore, a user-friendly recipe and guidebook to a more ethical way to buy, cook and eat meat. Welcome, Laura and Grant. Australians are the third highest per capita consumers of meat in the world. 90% of the pork and chicken that we eat is factory farmed, which is a system that produces cheap product for the consumer, but at a devastating cost on several different levels. Feather and Bone provide meat supplied only from farmers that engage in regenerative agricultural practices, a farming system that prioritises balance over yield. Can you explain a little bit about this concept for those of us that may be new to it or unfamiliar with it?
Yes, absolutely. When we first started on our butchery journey, well, I should say when Grant first started on this journey, he was preoccupied with finding animals that were rare breeds or heritage breeds, and he'd become aware of the lack of diversity in the animal product offering for a number of reasons, and he was energized by the opportunity for there to be different kinds of products available, as in not just beef, but maybe Angus beef or Wagyu beef or even more. And he also understood that genetic diversity was a really important pillar of sustainability. Without genetic diversity, without complex, intricate relationships between different kinds of creatures, you don't get a robust, healthy, resilient system. So that was what first started driving him. But as he sought out those who were growing different breeds of animals, he and I, when I joined him, started to understand that the farmers who were working with these different breeds of animals and who'd selected those breeds for their flavour profile, but also, of course, for their contribution to the ecosystems of the farms they were running, what we started to understand was that the farmers in some ways placed a greater priority on the health of the soil than the health of the animals that they were actually farming for profit. And that was intriguing to us. And over the course of time, we started to understand that what these farmers were focused on was ecosystem health, starting with soil and then that spreading out through all the living creatures within a farm. And this idea of regenerative farming, literally regenerating landscape, is a really critical one, particularly in Australia, where we have a very ancient, very, very dry landscape, very thin topsoil that's been farmed in quite a brutal way with conventional farming for the last couple of 100 years. And there's a lot of repair work that needs to be done to reintroduce balance and fertility and resilience into that landscape. So these regenerative farmers, or rather their practice is regenerative, what they're focused on is creating really balanced ecosystems, balanced landscapes where all of the creatures in that landscape are as important as each other. And it's their interactions that create the vibrant platform for health and vitality. Regeneration is literally regenerating landscape, but it's also about giving every living creature within that landscape the greatest opportunity to express its genetic potential. And so what you end up with is farm landscapes within which there's greater carbon sequestration, there's greater water holding capacity, there's incredibly diverse life forms of all kinds, from the microbes in the soil through to the insects, through the plants, through to the animals that the farmer is raising for profit. And it ends up being a system where the farmer's job is almost just to get out of the way of nature and let nature, which is superior in every way in managing balance and ecosystems, to do its job.
So you also mentioned in the book that you're the proud owner of several retired layer chickens who've taken up residence in your backyard in Marrickville, which you also mentioned is great for introducing some biodiversity to your soil with the added benefit of the occasional egg. Do you have any other suggestions on how we can simplify or adapt regenerative farming practices to introduce some biodiversity to our own backyard?
It's sort of diversity in the plants that you have in your yard. Probably less lawn would be a good start. And chickens are obviously very useful for contributing fertility and processing scraps, but they do eat quite a lot of things too. So you sort of got to protect what you plant. If you're closely attached to it, they might decide that they like the tomatoes as much as you do. So fencing becomes an issue. But apart from that, they're a great bonus for the garden.
So, chapter 5 of The Ethical Omnivore focuses on the dying art of whole animal butchery. And you go into the mathematics of modern butchery practices as informed by our consumption patterns of particular cuts of meat. You mentioned several examples, probably the most obvious one being the miracle Christmas ham. But the one that stood out to me was the cattle that Feather and Bone buys direct from the farm, that only 50% of the carcass yields cut that most consumers are familiar with and comfortable cooking with. And you've got a quote from the book that says, while we can turn the remaining 50% into products like dice, mince, sausages and broth, but if we're going to pay proper dues to the life given up to feed us and not waste a thing, customers need to be persuaded to jump in the deep end and try new cuts. So the second half of the book is titled Let's Eat, and it's a collection of recipes featuring both familiar cuts and those that have fallen out of the common culinary repertoire in recent years. One of my earliest culinary memories is my mum's lamb
I
spry,
love
which I
that,
haven't
yeah.
seen. I know. Why have these cuts fallen out of favour, and what can we do to bring them back, and why is it important that we bring them back?
It really closely mirrors the rise of industrial agriculture, the providing of so-called prime cuts to the exclusion of other cuts, and the adaptation of animals' shape and size, so that, for instance, in a chicken, the breast meat is probably twice as much now as it was only 50 years ago. The evolution of industrial agriculture has created the sense that you only need to eat those pieces from an animal, and that's quite all right, and they're cheap enough, so why would you argue with that? We would say that the argument is that the cost of that is greater than the reward, both in terms of animal welfare, the people who look after those animals, in many cases, especially in terms of intensive industrial agriculture, and for the choice that the consumer gets. So most of these recipes and ingredients would be very familiar to our elderly parents or grandparents, or virtually anyone who would read this. So we've only really dropped a generation or two, but that those one or two generations means that we've lost a significant amount of skill and kitchen know-how. Your memory of your mother's cooking, that would have been relatively standard to cook offal probably once every 1 or 2 weeks. Now it's seen as a sort of an exotic peculiarity, unless it's in the form of pate or something like that, where it's sort of denatured. But that would have been extraordinarily ordinary 50 years ago, if you excuse the extraordinarily ordinary. It's certainly commonplace, and it's not now, but it's a very recent phenomenon, and it is about what industrial agriculture says that we can have endlessly. But that's what we're contesting, is that the cost of providing those just singular cuts, whether it's eye fillet or breast fillet, is not worth the exchange.
It's interesting because you were also talking about how meats that are unfamiliar cuts to modern consumers that are cured in traditional methods. Now, the palate is quite unfamiliar to modern consumers, that it might be a bit too intense.
Yeah, flavour and texture, actually. Yeah, well, they are more flavoursome. And chicken is almost the most insipid meat available now. It virtually has no flavour. Chicken breast is close to flavourless, but that becomes desirable if it's dressed up with sauces and lots of salt. So the way it gets processed then becomes the critical thing rather than the object itself or the ingredient itself.
I have to mention, I did try one of the recipes on the weekend.
Oh, yes. Which one?
I tried the chicken, the basic one. My enthusiasm's a bit greater than my skill. So I tried the chicken with pine nuts.
Oh, that's Catherine Summerlad's one.
Yeah, it was beautiful.
Oh, yeah, it's delicious, isn't it?
And very user-friendly given my skill levels.
Well, that's the point of it. I mean, there are some harder recipes in there, but the point was to offer recipes from our community who are all different kinds of people. The point is that sometimes people look at food like the food that we sell and say, oh, that's outside my price range, or that's only for affluent people. But really, fact is that anybody can choose to eat like this if they want to. It does take a certain series of decisions, and there are choices that have to be made. You have to inform yourself a little bit more about which parts of the animal you're eating, and you might have to spend a little bit more time in the preparation and sourcing. But we have people who don't think twice about dropping plenty of money on the food that they buy from us, and others for whom it's a really, really careful decision, and they choose the secondary cuts, they choose really particular things, and they might not eat meat very often, but when they do, they choose to eat meat that they feel matches their belief system and their ethics and the production systems they want to support. So the point of those recipes really was to say, look, all sorts of different kinds of people do this, and you can do it too.
Even me.
Yeah, and me.
You also talk in the book about the complex and quite contrary relationship we've developed with the food that we prepare and consume. You write that on one hand, there's this sharp decline in the time we spend making and cooking food and the importance we attach to the traditional understanding that food is medicine. But on the other hand, we've become utterly obsessed with the idea of food. So obviously the COVID-19 lockdown and the social distancing environment has obviously intensified this issue in recent weeks, with people turning to online influencers as their only access to the outside world, and in a desperate attempt to relieve boredom, I suppose. What can we do to capitalise on this moment in time to encourage a shift towards a more sustainable approach to food consumption?
I'll let Laura answer that, but I would just say before she starts that the interesting thing there is time, and that suddenly people have time, and so people have started baking again and doing things that would have been, again, fairly standard 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago. Generally, people feel time poor, and that's why they're looking for cuts that are very quick to cook, but Laura can expand on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it has a little bit to do with the previous question, which is that at a certain point, if you get used to something, then that becomes what you ask for. And what you're used to determines the extent of your imagination and your desire. So if customers are going to butcher shops and they're being presented with a particular range of cuts, that defines the extent of their knowledge and understanding. So that's what they ask for. And then the butcher gets those cuts in because that's what the customers are asking for, and it becomes a self-fulfilling thing, and it just gets narrower and narrower and narrower unless somebody says, hang on, here's an option, here's an alternative, here's another way of looking at things. And I think what Grant's saying is right. In this time where people do have more time, and also they've been catapulted into a fearful position, suddenly questioning everything that's going on around them and their safety and their security, there's a heightened sensitivity to some of these things. So people are exploring a little bit more, they're questioning a bit more. We've seen an increase in people coming to us because they're saying, I had time to stop and think about it, and I thought, I only want to eat healthy food. I want to know where my food comes from. I want to understand the animals I'm eating were raised. And so it forced people to stop and consider things a little bit more carefully, which is really welcome. And that's the start of it, because the change in terms of food is going to be grassroots. Legislation is important. Changing regulations is critical. Political will is critical, but that's a slow process. What really changes things in our experience is what people buy. Every dollar they spend is a dollar that they're voting for a different food system. Whether you buy an intensive packet of intensive chicken breast, that's a vote for an intensive production system. If you buy something else, it's a vote for something else. So I think people are starting to there's a glimmer of awareness around that now, and there's nothing like a bit of a shock to make people stop and consider things, and that's what we had. So I think it's an opportunity for these kinds of conversations to occur.
For my final question, as this is a library podcast, we always like to finish by asking for reading recommendations. And you mentioned in the book, in the Ethical Omnivore, that you did a huge amount of reading while you were establishing Feather and Bone. You both did. And given that you were new to the industry and wanted to learn as much as you could, do you have any reading recommendations for anyone wanting to learn more about regenerative agriculture or environmentally sustainable food practices in general?
Oh, there's lots of, there are just piles and piles of books. And what's, I guess, really exciting is that there's more and more and more of this material coming out constantly now. So 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, there were some amazing books that had been written by the people who started some of this thinking. But since that time, there's just this increasing cascade of fantastic stuff written about all of these issues. Particularly when it comes to meat, I think there's more and more interesting stuff happening. But there's also some fantastic websites that are really worth going to. In Australia, there's a few standouts, depending where you want to jump in. Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu is a really important book to read. That's a really particular book. There's a great book called The Call of the Reed Warbler by Charlie Massey, which is a really important book about Australian regenerative agriculture.
I'd just say that Michael Collins' The Omnivore's Dilemma is a very good, readable,
a good starting point.
As a background to these sorts of concerns. And he's very skilled at amassing information, but also conveying it with a journalistic flair. If you're going to probably read one book to introduce you to the ideas, I'd almost say that The Omnivore's Dilemma is the best starting point. For background, though, Eric Roll's A Million Wild Acres is a really extraordinary book and provides an overview of how we came to do European-style agriculture in Australia, and also The Bush by Don Watson. I think those two provide really good context for the issues that are discussed really clearly in Omnivore's Dilemma.
There's a whole list of books and websites in the back of our book. These are the core ones, I suppose. So it's a good reference if you are looking for more stuff.
Thanks for your time, Grant and Laura. The Ethical Omnivore has recently been published by Murdoch Press and is available at all good local booksellers. If you'd like to continue the conversation with Grant and Laura, you can subscribe to the regular Feather and Bone newsletter or the Chew the Fat blog. Details are available on the Feather and Bone website. You can also share recipes and cooking tips by joining the Friends of Feather and Bone Facebook community. If you'd like to take advantage of some of Grant and Laura's reading suggestions, you can find many of these titles available for reservation in our online library catalogue. Thank you for listening, and look out for more upcoming digital content through the Inner West Library What's On and social media channels.